today?
Growing luminous. On the mystic path, we create our own light, and at first we struggle blind and baffled, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, unable to think, unable to imagine. We seem deserted by dream, vision, or inspiration, and our meditation barren altogether. But let us persist through weeks or months, and sooner or later that stupor disappears. Our faculties readjust themselves and do the work we will them to do. Never did they do their own work so well. The dark caverns of the brain begin to grow luminous. We are creating our own light. George William Russell.
Thank you. So, we welcome you all to the Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversational circle. And we're honored today to have Bob Buss give our talk today. And Renee has asked me to moderate since she lost her voice. So, we're glad she's here, but hopefully she won't talk too much because she's not going to have a voice. And Bob was a professor of religious studies and has had done a Buddhist practice for many, many years. He's given many talks that have been very inspirational and very important for us. And we welcome you, Bob, and turn the microphone over to you.
Well, thank you. And it's probably good that there may not be a lot of people here today because you should be out protesting.
Yeah. Yes.
It's Gay Pride Month, and there's a parade here in Honolulu.
Be safe, have fun.
And also, this is No King's Day. That's happened before, but that's also today. And across the United States, a number of people are gathering in civil disobedience, nonviolent resistance. And, if you look at the pictures, obviously something like No King's Day has a number of people with a particular point of view that they're expressing, and they've got signs and other things to communicate that. But then inevitably, you'll see other people protesting the other direction, saying, no, this is actually a good thing. This is basically something that, you know, President Trump, for example, is not a king, but he's trying to do the right thing for the country, and I believe he's right. And so that idea is important, I think. I'm going to start by giving some words from a philosopher that I admire greatly, one of the greatest Anglo-American philosophers, John Stuart Mill. He's known as a utilitarian, ethics of balancing good and bad results and consequences to then say, well, this is the greatest good for the greatest number. But he himself was quite sensitive to the idea of protest, and he wrote a wonderful book called On Liberty, on freedom. And the focus of that book is really saying that protest, civil disobedience, free expression is important to us both as individuals and as society. It's good for society to have free expression. And you might say, well, why is that the case? And in the book on liberty, he gives a number of reasons why. And I think they're quite sensitive and ones that can help us as we look at our own views. He says there's a number of possibilities when you look at someone giving free expression, and it differs from your own view. They may be right. I'm not infallible. I've got a lot of views that may not be right. I may be wrong about them. And if I listen carefully to another person's point of view and I allow it to be taken in and considered, listen to their arguments, you may find that, yeah, they make sense. And perhaps there's something I hadn't considered. And I may change my view because I was wrong. Another possibility, and this is something I think is very true in general, is maybe there's some right on both sides. In other words, they may not be completely right, but they have a point. I may not be completely right or completely wrong, and there's a little bit there on both sides. And that's important, that the truth is complicated, and it always helps to be able to look at both sides and sort of consider your argument and reconsider it. Something that may have been true in the past may not be true today. Times change and conditions change. racism in the 21st century is not the same as racism in the 20th century, and certainly not the same in the 19th century when the Civil War was being fought. Uh, Certainly, progress has been made in certain ways and not in other ways. Um, and thirdly, Mill says, it may be the case that even if they're wrong, it's good for them to be able to express it because that forces me to look at my own view and defend it. In other words, I think you're wrong for these reasons. Well, that process of thinking through something is good for me and good for society. So it helps me understand the nature of it, of the issue, and be able to defend myself and make good arguments for my view. So that free exchange of ideas, he says, is crucial to finding common truth. That is, the truth for the common good, for the common society. And it's an important aspect of that. So the only restrictions, he says, to free expression is when, and generally it's expressed as you're about to incite a riot. The famous expression is you can't yell fire in a crowded theater because it could cause a panic and people could be hurt. So you have to have some restraint, and there's certain times that perhaps maybe free expression is not appropriate. For example, a protest with swastikas and saying, neo-Nazism is good may not be appropriate in a Jewish community where, again, you could incite a riot and violence. So there's proper places, proper times, proper methods. And in general, those that argue for uh, civil disobedience argue for it being nonviolent. And if you incite violence, you're really going against that basic idea. And certain times um, are difficult. During the pandemic, we were a society in crisis, and so we had to deal with that. And in wartime, it may be that leaders have to take extraordinary means. President Lincoln is sometimes criticized for suspending habeas corpus, in other words, arresting someone without giving a good reason why. And he said, well, that's because of this protecting the society in time of war. Um, and he said the context was such that there were a number of people who were dangerous to the war effort, and you don't have as much free expression as you could. Um, Something like interning Japanese American citizens. Again, you're suppressing their rights, and you can make a case that it's needed because of time of war. A good case was made in this case that it was too prejudiced. You were really arguing against a group rather than individual behavior, and so it was said to be later unconstitutional. In other words, it was a step too far. Um, so that's kind of a background there. I think the other way of looking at it is we have a human right, uh, and that human right should be defended. So that's an aspect of that as well. Um, it's interesting that John Stuart Mill, as sensitive and um, open-minded as he was, had a blind spot. He basically accepted and promoted imperialism, colonialism. He had an expression for it called tolerant uh, imperialism. I'm not sure how tolerant imperialism could really be, but he basically felt that along with social Darwinism, the strong survival of the fittest, well, that could be expressed socially, so that there are civilized countries that are more advanced and therefore have a duty to bring up more backward societies. Uh, you might tell by my facial expressions, I don't like those kind of words, and I don't think they're particularly helpful. And, the idea of no matter how tolerant the imperialism is, I think it's a very short road to Eurocentrism, Europe good, the rest of the world bad, white supremacy, white good, all other colors no matter what, red, brown, yellow, are bad. Um, Cultural and ethnic prejudices, what in Hawaii we call settler violence against the indigenous people, or indigenous Hawaiians. Um, and so I think, there was a blind spot that he had, and it's probably good that he hopefully listened. And so just because you listen doesn't mean that you find that your way right through something. Um, I'd like to talk a little bit about the difference between ethics in the West and ethics in Asia. Um, Ethics in the West is quite individual. Um, John Stuart Mill in utilitarianism argued for the greatest good for the greatest number of individuals, and the individual was the one choosing which direction to go. To say you have a duty is an individual duty to do what's right based on your own reasoning. Um, in the East, I think you have a sense of an individual self, but you also have a sense of a social self. I think most of us have seen the metaphor of the net of Indra. Well, each little interstice of the net has a jewel, and the jewel is the individual, but it reflects every other jewel. And that in between each of those is another way of looking at the self. The self is not only an individual, it's in process of communication with others. And so Watsuji Tetsuro, a modern Confucian, he died in 1960, um, studied a great deal of Western philosophy, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Kant. He actually studied with Heidegger. And so he knew the West very well, but he pushed this idea that that individual self is contradicted by the social self. And the social self is contradicted by the individual self. And he says there's a sense of emptiness or nothingness or negation between them. And so that's a different kind of feeling to ethics, I think, um, that basically um, true ethics is also that in-betweenness of accepting another person as a we, not just as a them. Um, A philosopher at the University of Hawaii, Roger T. Ames, has written a number of books on Confucianism. And he basically argues that the three main types of ethics, utilitarianism, the balance between consequences, good and bad, a sense of duty, deontological ethics, and finally Aristotle's virtue ethics, a good character, are all um, not quite true for the East. And he's looking primarily at the Confucian tradition. And he really argues that that sense of an individual pushes it too far in that direction. And so he comes up with a fourth view, um, and that's he calls role ethics. And we're kind of getting to the point where protest then becomes I do it because it's my duty, I do it because it's for the greatest good. In the sense of role ethics, I do it because I'm the kind of person that is um, manifesting the truth. I'm letting the truth guide me, and therefore other people can emulate me or pay attention to the processes that I have. Um, there's an interesting poem that I think realizes this. It's by Su Shi, and the poem is horizontally, I see the ridges, I see the mountains stretching out. Vertically, I see the peaks. Far or near, high or low, each affords a different view. I cannot see the true face of Mount Lu because I am standing within the mountain's top. In other words, you can see these wonderful views, but I can't really see the true mountain because I'm standing on the mountain. Um, I am the view, not so much I see the view from it. Um, so just to wrap up, I'll end by looking at what I was told was my topic, which is basically social activism and the point of view of that. And I'm going to give three examples briefly. Henry David Thoreau is famous for writing an essay called Civil Disobedience. And he says we have a moral obligation to resist unjust laws. And so we have, and unjust actions by government. So we have to do that. In his own case, he felt that he couldn't pay the taxes uh, because he felt his country was wrong in two ways. One, it was fighting a war against Mexico that was trumped up, it was land hungry, it wasn't a just war. And then, of course, the whole context of slavery was erupting. It was pre-Civil War when Thoreau was writing this. And in both cases, he just felt, I can't support this government. And so he didn't pay it. He was put in jail, not for very long. Somebody paid his poll tax. I mean, he didn't make a lot of money, so somebody paid $5 and he was out. It's not like he had a big poll tax to pay, but he felt he had to resist, and he had to resist nonviolently. So he was put in jail, but he didn't hurt anyone in the process of doing it. It's important to uphold your conscience, to refuse to participate in a system of wrongdoing. And this is the power of nonviolent resistance. Gandhi was very influenced by Thoreau, and he said also by Jesus Christ, especially the Sermon on the Mount. And Gandhi sort of adds the three ideas of civil disobedience: that it should be nonviolent, and this was argued by Thoreau, but in Gandhi's sense, it would be ahimsa, non-harming, and non-cooperation. It should be public. You can't just think it, you got to do it. And it should be persuasive. It's meant to make a point. And the most famous example, I think, of civil disobedience is the Salt March of Mahatma Gandhi, marching to the sea. It was against the law to make salt, and so he marches to the sea, which was several hundred miles, and they make salt, and the government arrests them. Um, and the process of walking, the process of protesting as they were walking, uh, made huge publicity marks. And it was nonviolent, but very powerful. And so, this is an example. It didn't end colonialism in India. England took many more years to fight that, including after the World War II. It had to kind of wait that out and then do it again. But that was important. And the point that Gandhi raises is satyagraha. Not that you should do what's right, but you should be what's right. Satyagraha is truth within myself. Truth force comes out of me, and I identify with the truth. Sat is truth. And that means that I transform myself into a role model for others. Gandhi always said, don't do it because you're copying me. But if you feel the rightness and the truth of that, then you become satyagraha. You go forward with, and we can do it together, but not because we're together, but because we agree fundamentally with the truth, which is more than either of us. And so that's a kind of sense of Gandhi. Gandhi read Thoreau and said, there is no other land, there is no other life but this one. You must live in the present and launch yourself on every wave. Find your eternity in each moment. So finally, I'd like to end with Martin Luther King and, of course, the modern civil rights movement in America, again, influenced by Gandhi and by Thoreau, and by his own deep Christian faith. He adds the idea of what he called true pacifism, a courageous confrontation of evil by the power of love. And here again, we find that there are a process of coming to this. King said there are three ways to get going with nonviolence. One is to collect all the facts and make sure that an injustice is being done. Um, People may complain about various things, but injustice would be it's based on a prejudice rather than somehow the common good. Um, and we have to look at that and make sure that it's there. We then have to negotiate, discuss, dialogue, um, to see what the resolution would be. And this is done in Montgomery. They were, well, what should we do? And they came up with the Montgomery bus strike. That was hitting at a symbolic action, refusing to ride the bus because it was prejudicial, and it sort of reflected the prejudice of the time. Blacks had to move to the back, and if there wasn't enough room, they had to get off, and that was racist. And so that separate but equal element was what they were fighting against. And then King says, once you have that idea of process, then you have to purify yourself and prepare yourself and your fellow uh, movement persons uh, mentally and spiritually. And this was an important part. And only then can you have direct action to create a crisis that forces some kind of response. And certainly the bus strike did that. So King said it has to be active, not passive. It has to be nonviolent love given willingly. And nonviolent love does not sink to the level of the hater. Um, this is critical, I think, in Christianity for Martin Luther King Jr. It's also critical in the Dhammapada in Buddhism and a number of places that uh, we go forward by peace, or what Gandhi called truth, and that's how we live. So that's sort of a background. I wanted to sort of talk about uh, nonviolent resistance in general, but also based on the idea of the obligation to have freedom of expression and against censorship. So, wonder if anyone has any comments or questions. How is your own experience with this?
Cliff, I see your hand up. I was on mute. Would you had something to share?
Well, every time Bob speaks, I absolutely love it. And I mean, the serendipity or the timeliness of today's topic and your talk on it is just quite amazing. I was struck by your distinction between ethics in the West and the East, in the West having to do with the individualism or individuality, and in the East more with a collective or societal sense of ethics or of self, is the way I understood that to be. Is that what you were saying, Bob, kind of?
Yeah, and if you look at Confucianism, the key value is hard to understand from the Western point of view. It's family responsibilities. Elder son to younger son has to look up to the elder son. Elder daughter has to be the role for the younger daughter. Husband and wife, friend to friend. Family relations then become important. And you really have to kind of step back and say, what is the family that we're talking about here? And I think Martin Luther King would call the civil rights movement a type of family. I think he was really arguing that kind of way, that there was a we that was more important than the I. And certainly, I think Gandhi would say that truth is not just my truth, it's bigger than me. So it's interesting to look at Confucianism and really see the focus on the we as being very important. And that role model is kind of important. And if you can't find a good person near you that you can emulate, then the Confucius said you go back to a golden age and find somebody there, like the Duke of Zhou or Yang or Tong, these various sort of mythical, maybe they lived, maybe they didn't. One of them was interesting. I think my favorite is King Wen. And King Wen, we don't know if there was such a person, but Wen is the Chinese word for culture. And so it's really king culture. Look, king philosophy. Read all your books and find out what the common good is and what draws us together as a family. And that's important.
Oh, yeah. So the question I was thinking about or brewing on here is at the beginning, you pointed out that it's important to see what's true or good on both sides of a debate. I don't see how you can do that with racism or slavery, really. But anyways, it seems like the idea of conscience, there's the idea of individual conscience, and there's the idea of collective conscience. And so the East maybe has a little bit more emphasis on the collective conscience and the West more on the individual conscience. And I think there's probably truth in both of those. And I was a teacher, a professor that Renee and I had in college, Professor Raghavan Iyer, from India, and but he went to Oxford and so forth, and I think got 3 PhDs there. He wrote a book called The Glass Curtain Between East and West. And I was thinking about that as you were speaking, because so a friend of mine went recently to Walden Pond and saw, I think, a display of a bunch of Thoreau's possessions, and one of them was a well-worn little blue copy of the Bhagavad Gita. And he references the Bhagavad Gita quite a bit in his writings. And so I think he was very, very much influenced, not just by the Bhagavad Gita, but by Eastern teachings. And then it's interesting that there's this kind of like tennis match going on, but because then Gandhi is very, very much influenced by Thoreau at an early development of his ideas about civil disobedience. And then the tennis ball goes back to the United States with King being incredibly influenced by Gandhi. You know, he had a big picture of Gandhi in his office and was so an influence. So it seems like there's this dialogue about ethics and conscience and civil disobedience that has been going on between the East and the West, and maybe somehow breaking down to some extent this glass curtain between the two cultures, the more Eastern culture and the Western culture. But in terms of the idea of nonviolence, I mean, today it was over 2,700 protests, 2,700 protests in the United States, with over 7 million people protesting the idea of the collapse of the separation of powers into just to the executive branch. That's what Trump would love to have happen. And I don't really see much good arguments on that side of the other side, which I would be out there protesting, actually, and have done quite a bit of it, actually. Anyways, it seems to me that what Trump is doing and his administration is doing by putting all of these ICE agents and so forth and National Guard into these cities, primarily Democratic cities that are more blue state Democrat cities, is he's actually trying to poke the bear. He's actually trying to get there to be a violent response to his overreach, really, of executive power, so that he can then do the insurrection. He can call out the Insurrection Act, which gives him like complete unblocked power from Congress and the judicial branch, ideally before the midterm elections come up. So I think we're in which is only a very short period of time between now and the 2026 midterms. So it seems like we could be moving toward a situation right now in the United States where our voting rights are even taken away from us if President Trump is able, because of, quote, violence on the left side, able to call out an insurrection act and say, because of that, there's going to be no voting until things calm down. And that's my determination as to when things calm down. So it seems to me that democracy in America is very fragile at this time. And I understand, you know, we're supposed to understand and have a good conversation with the other side. But it seems like the other side, just like back in the Civil War times, how do you have that conversation when you feel like they're playing for all the marbles right now in terms of getting rid of basically all the values of democracy that most of us hold dear, which is voting and freedom of expression and so forth like that. So that's a long question.
Yeah, no, and it's an incredibly important question. And I kind of go back to Thoreau when he says, we have an obligation to fight against injustice, whether it's unjust laws or unjust actions by government. And you're basically describing some unjust action. Um, and then basically you have to look at what are you going to do about it. You can express that. In the case of Thoreau, he also broke the law. He not only refused to pay his taxes, which was non-cooperation, but he was himself an abolitionist and his family. So black slaves escaping from the South, passing through where he lived, he would protect them in his cellar and as best he could, getting them through Walden and Concord and on their way basically to freedom, which was not going to be in the United States. It was going to be in Canada. Um, so he was part of the Underground Railroad. And that was against the law. There was a law that said you must not harbor runaway slaves. It's a controversial law, and he felt an unjust law. So he didn't obey that law. And then I think the important thing with Thoreau is, okay, if you're going to do that, you got to kind of cowboy up and say, that's the karma. I will pay the consequences. And he knew that, not paying your poll tax was a night in jail or a couple nights in jail. Breaking the Runaway Slave Act was a bigger thing and could result in much more prison time. You have to face up to that, and that's your resistance. It has to be public. It can't just be in your head. Um, Martin Luther King once said that he got his ideas from the Bible and his methods from Gandhi. Gandhi was pretty good at methods. The Salt March was extremely effective, and it was nonviolent, but on his part, not on the British part. The British part, they beat the crap out of them once they got to that coast and tried to make the salt. And there were many cases when the British reacted violently to his nonviolent views. You have to pay the price. You have to keep going. It takes tremendous courage to be nonviolent, and you do it because the truth is surrounding you. So that's an important part of that. And when King said he followed his methods, well, it was the march, the boycott, uh, refusing to buy certain products from the British, like cloth and home weave your own cloth. Well, it's not going to look the same. It's going to result in clothing that looks kind of primitive. And he was, ridiculed for wearing that kind of clothing, that kind of cloth. But he says, that's another form of protest, is being self-sufficient. And so Gandhi spent a lot of time in jail. And sometimes he was too famous to put in jail. Not often. They usually did get him in jail. But the people who followed him had even more, perhaps, risk of being beat up and jailed. The consequences are there. It's not easy to know what to do. This view of Gandhi, Thoreau, and um, Martin Luther King Jr. is ultimately, and this is just their belief, ultimately nonviolence is more effective in changing the mind of the violent side. I don't know how realistic that is sometimes. I mean, when you saw the actions of the British during that um, that Indian struggle for independence, it's pretty violent. When you look at Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, it's pretty violent. The famous bridge where they're going across and just being beaten down. Um, People get hurt in violent resistance and nonviolent resistance. Um, it's
Bob,
admirable, I think, to look
let's
at
check with
people.
Renee. Bob, could we check with Renee? She had her hand up. Let's see what she has to say. Would you mind sharing, Renee?
Yes, thank you so much, Bob, for pointing us to these excellent examples of nonviolent resistance and some of the thought behind it. Our theme for the week is compassionate ideation. And I'm wondering, how that might help here with the question that Cliff's having. Um, it seems to me, particularly in Gandhi's case, he did something that had never been done in history, to have an entire nation freed from an empire, and in a huge nation on Gandhi's part, through nonviolent resistance. And so it seems as though that took so much creativity to figure out how such a thing could come about. I mean, he really didn't have um, any maps to follow. I mean, he had this one little example from Thoreau, not paying a tax, but he did something that was huge with the whole country. And so I'm wondering, maybe, maybe we're at a point where we could use creative imagination, creative ideation, compassionate ideation is the term, compassionate ideation, to find a new solution that has never been done before. Maybe that's what's
Yeah.
talked upon.
And I think these three figures, Gandhi, and especially Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, and Thoreau, were all doing that. When Thoreau looks to the Bhagavad Gita, as was pointed out, he found something there. It's not very explicit. You're finding it, and because he felt that the truth was so important, that Satyagira was out my motivation for thinking. That's where my ideas come from, that he found it there. And so he found inspiration there to come to the idea of nonviolence. Uh, the King also, felt that he looked into the Bible, especially the Sermon on the Mount, and he found something there. And he then had that compassionate ideation to then not just read what was written, but to then form it into ideas that would be appropriate action. And so that was the kind of process that they were going through. And I think similarly, Thoreau, in reading what he read, uh, Confucianism, Bhagavad Gita, Western writers, again, he felt this call to be nonviolent, and that was an appropriate action. From the Buddhist tradition, I think you could find inspiration in the Dhammapada, and from the early Buddhists saying that you never benefit by returning anger for anger, hatred for hatred. You only truly overcome anger and hatred through love. And so that's very explicit in the Christian tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. But it's implied by Gandhi in truth. Truth and love are not separate. And so then the idea is, how do you work on this? And Cliff is exactly right. There's no easy time. We're in a time of crisis. There's no question of that. And in a time of great division of our country, similar to the Civil War, I would say, as bifurcated as that. And so, what is the truth? And come up with the ideas of how you should behave within that context. Um, it's interesting that Watsuji, when he was arguing, said that climate is an interesting way of looking at this. Uh, we come to define our own sense of climate, and that gives us the way we feel about the world. You know, I come to Hawaii growing up in Minnesota, and, the coldest Hawaii ever gets feels like a brisk fall day to me. It's nothing. My climatization is different than a native person from Hawaii. And that, if you deal with that in terms of ideation, then I think you realize that different people have different ways of looking at it, and you have to come together. So all of the jewels reflect each other, but each jewel is different. And so, that difference is one of the things you're trying to bring together. And why Gandhi said, don't just follow me. Don't think that I've got the answer and you should follow it. Look to me and then find the truth within yourself. And then it will come forth as your idea.
Hello. Hi.
I was really struck, Bob, with a couple things you said.
Mhm.
Not
No,
to
I'm
do
I'm
what
on a
is
Zoom
right.
call. But go ahead.
Whoops.
Go ahead.
Not to do what is right, but to be what is right and find the truth within yourself. And the
Mhm.
other was nonviolent love does not sink to the hater.
Mhm.
And the difficulty with the time right now is it's so divided and there is not a dialogue because it's either black or white. And I can go in the middle, but it's like when we have a lot of friends that feel very differently than we do, and some people have said, well, how can you stay with them when they believe that way? And I sort of see it, and I try to work with love in the way that it's almost like we have different religions or different ways of looking at things, and the people are wonderful. They're very kind, and you know, it's just they're amazing, and we love to be with them, but we don't talk politics, we don't talk spirituality, because that's not part of what we can do to find a common ground. And when we do, it's so black and white. It's like it's really a difficult place to be. And so looking at nonviolent love does not sink to the hater. How do we love those that are feeling differently, but how do we work with ourselves to find out what our truth is and the best way to respond, because this is a very scary time and there's so much happening, and that's why I loved all the protests. And my way isn't to go to protests, and it says to be giving willingly and to be active, but it's like each of us has to find out what our truth is. Mine's prayer and meditation and being kind to people and living as I feel God wants me to live. And if I'm called to do something, I'll do it. But it's like trying to hear inside what the best way for each of us is to react in a nonviolent way to the fear and all the hatred that's going on.
Yeah. No, you're completely right. I just came out of a 3 day Zen retreat just because I knew I needed some space, and we weren't reading newspapers, we weren't online, we were just meditating. And I came back kind of refreshed, and I got back into the social media and worldliness of it slowly. I was kind to myself. That's partly there. And, I could have mentioned someone that Martin Luther King nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He himself got it. He nominated Thich Nhat Hanh. And Thich Nhat Hanh was, of course, caught in the Vietnamese War. And I admire him as a fellow Buddhist because, in a sense, he wasn't able to do anything. All he was able to do from himself was to heal those who were suffering. And he healed people on both sides. Uh, After the war, he had many uh, followers who were former soldiers on whichever side, and he basically said, "I'm dealing with your trauma." And and one person said, "Well, I killed a child. How do I deal with that?" And he said, "Well, go deep within yourself, and then I ask you to find a child who needs help and help them. In other words, go the other way. Rather than hurting a child, help a child. And that will help you sort of deal with an idea that, you feel tremendous guilt about. And that's where this compassionate ideation is. You have to sort of transform yourself out of that suffering. Especially if you feel like you did something wrong, that, and not just killing a child, but wiping out a whole village, the My Lai massacre, a number of things that people were suffering with, and he dealt with their suffering. He didn't try to end the war. I mean, he basically dealt with the suffering that was happening during the war, after the war, and that's what he could do. His form of protest was really offering meditation practice and specific advice to those who were suffering because of it. And that's one way of perhaps responding to it.
Cliff, what do you want to say?
Well, in thoughts on your question, it seems like maybe initially we have to go deep within ourselves and affirm, the unity of humanity, that we're all human beings, all men are created equal, and see beyond all these ideologies and opinions and so forth that are out there, that deep down we're all struggling human beings trying to figure it out and live good lives and recognize that. I didn't know when Renee and I bought the house that we bought here on the street that just about everybody was a Trump fanatic. And so they put up all these signs that say, Trump for president and all this stuff all the time, and drove me nuts for a long time. But kind of the way I kind of started to respond to it is just that affirming our collect our humanity. And I'm thinking also that the golden rule is a good way of affirming that too, because that's in all the religions. But I always smile now and wave and look my neighbors in the eye and so forth. And I'm also thinking with this compassion ideation, there's maybe along with that could be creative imagination or ideation, in that I kind of like what they're doing up in Portland, where you're getting in all these funny costumes and protesting that way. But I think also like a sense of humor, can kind of break the tension between one side and the other. And so being able to kind of keep things in light sometimes is a way of getting through the tension of these diverse and polar viewpoints. So I try to do that, try best I can to kind of lighten things up. And I was thinking also that at the end of Malcolm X's life, and he was very much about violence and the cause of addressing racism, he disagreed with himself. I think at the end, Martin Luther King's position on nonviolence won him over. He was assassinated shortly after his views changed, but at the end, I think he saw that violence wasn't going to get us anywhere, because the reaction is going to be violent, and it's just going to be back and forth forever. So in terms of protesting, it has to be nonviolent. It should be creative, and ideally, I like what Portland's doing. It should be fun, because I think on the other side, these ICE agents are human beings too, even behind the mask. And if one can approach them as human beings and kind of maybe share a joke or look past that mask into the eye of that person and see their humanity, they're human beings with beating hearts just like us. And many of them feel incredibly uncomfortable at being ordered to perform the roles that they are. And so we try and win them over one by one, just by acknowledging and affirming their humanity along with ours, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're very much right. Um, I look to people who I admire, that I feel are uh, people that I can emulate or at least look up to and respect. And one of them is Abraham Lincoln. I think one of the values, and as you mentioned, creativity is one, but I think another core value is humility. And I don't, if you read his writings, he was not racist, but he also was humble enough to realize that the country was, and it wasn't ready for racial mixing. But he said, well, let's not talk about racial mixing. Let's just talk about equality of work. He said, I don't have to want my daughter to marry a black person to say she deserves to be paid for the wages for the work she's doing. In other words, we can make reforms that are systematic, that people can accept, when on a personal level they can't. So there's a difference between racism in the government and racism interpersonally. And I think at one point when he did do the Emancipation Proclamation, he was rising above even that and saying, well, now it's time to get ready. And I think Martin Luther King was saying that too. And he said, I have a dream. I may not get to the mountaintop with you, but that's, from the Bible saying, I don't know when it's going to happen, but I've done my share. And the thing I love about Abraham Lincoln is at one point when he gave his second inaugural address, he said, we have two sides fighting tooth and claw, just like we do right now, and both of them claim that God is on their side. And they believe that God is on their side. And he said, it seems to me that maybe God has his own thinking here, that God isn't on either one of the sides, but that God is a little bit disgusted with our history of racism, and he's going to make the Civil War go until we've paid the price. And it's not either side that can say they're the Christian soldiers. God has a truth bigger than the North or the South. And maybe it'll come back again if we become a nation under God. But we weren't a nation under God during the Civil War, and we may not be right now. We may really find that we have to then go deep within ourselves, as you say, and find our own value, um, our own sense of love, or satyagiri, truth, or whatever we want to call it, compassion, creativity. And that's part of what we can do. I mean, it may not seem like we're doing anything, but we're not contributing to the craziness directly. And then what can we do? Do we boycott? Do we write letters to the editor? Do we protest? I'm not, along with Diana, I don't usually go to protest movements. I did when I was, in the 70s when I was a college student, but not much. I lent my body to the movement occasionally, but I wasn't often on the front lines. But I certainly believed that the war was wrong from the very beginning. And I did try to understand the other side. I tried to understand the nature of all the participants in a way, and then you're limited. Part of what I think Watsuji meant when we create our own climate is that our climate is also created for us. I come out of Minnesota and I'm not going to feel cold in Hawaii. That's just the way I am. Um, and that's a given. My karma had me born in Minnesota, and culture comes with it. And I wasn't just my sensitivity to cold. I was a baby Lutheran, and I grew up Lutheran, and I grew up German, and those are two pretty interesting climates that you have to kind of work through. And you know, find your models and then believe in them. Most turns out most of my models are not German or Lutheran. Uh, they're Thich Nhat Hanh. They're Martin Luther King Jr., they're Thoreau, they're Gandhi, they're other people. Um, and then you have to emulate them. Every one of us will emulate our heroes differently. We may all love Thich Nhat Hanh, but we come to him and he guides us in individual ways. And I think this is very much what Jesus was saying when he said, you must follow the will of God within you. Listen to the will of God and follow God's will. You've got to find out what it is. You've got to be able to hear it before you can follow it.
Cliff, did you have some things you want to share?
I would, unless Mary wants to step in. We're a small group today, but it's a pretty good conversation, pretty important one we're having. Mary, you want to say anything right now, or?
Okay, I'll pipe in. But what I was thinking was what you were talking about, Cliff, about the humor and in the face of discouragement or I was thinking of the girl, the hippie who was putting the daisy into the rifle of the National Guard. Because yeah, I'm a child of the 70s, and yeah, my husband Dave was a conscientious objector, and I didn't come from any kind of military or non-military. It wasn't something in my family. We were all girls, and we didn't have brothers that had to worry about the draft and stuff like that. But yeah, humor is is very important. So amen.
And, Gandhi himself said, this Indian culture I come out of is a challenge for me too. I mean, his attitude towards women was one that was a constant growing process for him. How he treated his wife, how he treated other women. Uh, India is not a particularly uh, open society. Men and women are not treated equally necessarily, and he dealt with that. You find parts of your own culture that you need to kind of tweak a little and work with. And again, I think someone like Lincoln, uh, he looks to himself, but he also looks at where's the country? I'm the leader, I'm the president. How am I reflecting that? And part of that, looking to a person like Lincoln, is to realize that we don't have Lincoln in the president's office today. We got somebody else, and that someone else has what I would call some personality disorders. How he communicates with himself, how he expresses himself. Um, love is not his go-to emotion. It just isn't. It's just amazing when, yeah, that would be the natural response. In the recent or the assassination of the young man who was, forget his name now, but a spokesman for the MAGA movement. And his wife said, "Well, I'm a Christian and I forgive the person who was there." And President Trump was not able to say, "Wow, I really admire that." He just said, "Not me. I'd go for," And it was, we don't, as Martin Luther King argued, we stooping to the level of hatred just doesn't advance us forward. And that's just something we have to observe. And when we see a person taking a step back, we take 2 steps forward, and we see that that's not effective. And that's creative ideation too, is to see not only what we want to emulate, but what we want to non-emulate. That's a very Confucian value. You look at people that you think are admirable and you follow them. You look at people, in Confucian they call them small people. We look at those that are doing something wrong in our view, and we disemulate them. We look to ourselves and see if there's any part of that kind of attitude in us, and we can wash ourselves clean of it. Can go with that. And there's a lot of it is compassion towards ourselves and our ideas.
I'm curious, Cliff, you had something you wanted to say
Well,
before we're almost spoken.
I do have this little story I wanted to share before everything ends here. But I was thinking, Mary, that Gandhi had just a tremendous sense of humor. I mean, it just comes through. He was always making things light, and it just made things so much easier for people to work through things. And even Thoreau, he did have a great sense of humor. It was very dry and biting, but it was he was actually kind of a comedian in some ways. The way he's always saw the irony of things, and he wrote with that kind of wit about him. And Lincoln loved humor. He just had
Love,
all these little
love
books,
telling jokes.
always telling jokes. Just it was his main thing, and it's how he would lighten a room is by telling a story. And the movie about Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis is playing Lincoln is just absolutely fabulous. And the one story from that movie that really stuck with me is when he was in a room I think it was at the Capitol, and it's so interesting at that movie where Lincoln would get down on his hands and knees to stoke the fire, and keep the Oval Office warm. I'm going, that wouldn't happen today, that the president of the United States would be poking the fire and putting wood on the fire. But he had this congressman over, Theodis Stevens, who was played fantastically by Tommy Lee Jones, and they were in a debate about abolition. And Lincoln, Daniel Day-Lewis said, "Look, Congressman Stevens, I agree completely with you that we're both abolitionists. We both know that the truth is that all men are created equal. The problem is that all you're doing is taking a compass heading on the north. You just see a straight path to ending slavery. Whereas I see all the mountains, all the ridges, all the valleys, all the rivers that we have to cross to get there. So we need to have patience. We need to have humility. We need to have a sense of humor and an understanding. Try our best to understand things from the point of view of someone else, which is the harder path, the longer path, but it's the more lasting path, I think. So
Thank you so much. It's 4 o'clock, and I'm going to go over what's happening the next couple of weeks. And if someone would like to say a thank you to Bob at the end, that would be great. Next week, we are not going to have a Gems of Wisdom. We have the Diwali Festival is Sunday at 6 o'clock. And please go online and get your tickets if you're going in person. And also, you may see, if you're going in person, go online, get your tickets. And there's also, you can watch it on video. So I encourage everybody to participate with that. And then on November 1st, the tongue to speak is the topic. So it feels like we're filling in this whole idea with everything going on with our world of compassion and letting our light shine. And how do we do that on the path? So thank you, everybody. Would anyone like to give a thank you to Bob? Cliff?
Well, I think all of us are really benefited a great deal. I mean, I wish there was 1,000 people in this meeting today. I mean, what you had to share, Bob, was just fantastic and so apropos to the moment that we were in at this particular time. And I think I wish it was a dialogue amongst many people. But I think all of us here that got to hear what you had to say were really inspired and motivated to do as best we can the right and ethical thing we can in the present moment. And I think we take away from today's meeting some real gems, some gems of wisdom on how to do that. And so thank you, Bob, for all your study over the years that brought you to this moment to share all these ideas that you shared with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Did you want to say something, Renee?
Yeah, Cliff, could you tell them about November 1st?
No, but you mean the next GEMS meeting?
Yeah.
I mean, where I got my arm twisted multiple times.
Are you giving the talk on November 1st?
I guess I am. Yeah, Renee was pretty persuasive. You know, sometimes spouses are like that.
Yes.
If you want to eat or not sleep on the couch. So I said yes, and she wants me to speak a little bit about Lincoln and how he used speech in such an effective way, because the theme is what is it? Tongues. Those who have tongues to speak, let them speak, or something like that. I don't.
I just had it. Let's see. The tongue to speak.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I guess I'm going to try and tell some more stories about Lincoln, Mary.
That'd be great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope you feel better, Renee, and have a good trip. And we look forward to seeing you. If not next weekend, we'll see you on the following weekend. Blessings to you all. Good night.